All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're digging into a really fascinating paper that lays out a comprehensive case for what's known as complementarianism. It's a viewpoint on gender rules within the home and the church, and this argument is built on scripture, logic, and some pretty deep theology. So, let's get into it. So, here's how we're going to break this down. We're going to walk through this paper's argument in 5 main parts. First, we got to define the 2 big views on gender. Then, we'll look at the rules of the game the paper says we need to follow when we're interpreting the Bible. After that, we'll dive into the biblical pattern it points to, unpack its core idea of a cosmic object lesson, and finally, we'll look at how the paper weighs the probabilities and risks of each position. Okay, first things first. Before you can even get into a debate like this, you have to know what you're talking about, right? You need super clear definitions. The whole argument really hinges on understanding the basic disagreement between these 2 views. So, on one side, you have complementarianism. The paper defines this view as saying men and women are absolutely 100% equal in value and dignity, but they were designed by God for different roles that complement each other. Then, on the other side, you have egalitarianism. This view holds that there are no gender-based restrictions on roles at all. Men and women are, in the paper's terms, fully interchangeable. So the real friction point is right there, distinct roles versus total interchangeability. All right, next up, the paper says, hold on. Before we start throwing verses at each other, we have to agree on how we're going to read the evidence. It argues we need to establish the rules of interpretation first. And this is a really crucial point for their whole argument. It's not just about what a verse says. It's about the lens you use to read it. The paper claims that your interpretive framework, your hermeneutics, basically determines your conclusion before you even start. You've got to have a consistent method. So what are these rules? Well, the paper lays out 7 specific principles it thinks should guide the conversation. Things like using the standard grammatical historical method, letting the really clear Bible passages help us understand the fuzzy ones, and viewing the creation order in Genesis as the blueprint. It also makes a big deal about sticking to the reasons an author gives for a command and making sure interpretation works across the entire Bible. Now, this principle right here is a real linchpin for the paper's case. It says that when the Apostle Paul, for example, tells women in 1 Timothy not to teach men, he doesn't say, because of the culture here in Ephesus. No, he bases his reasoning on 2 massive, universal events, Adam being created first and the story of the fall. So the paper argues that means the command is timeless, not just some local cultural rule. Okay, so with those rules established, the paper moves into the evidence phase. And the goal here isn't to rely on just 1 or 2 proof texts, but to show what it sees as a consistent pattern that runs through the whole biblical story. And you can see that pattern laid out right here. The arguments pulls from Genesis, where Adam is created first, all the way to Paul's letters. It highlights passages like 1 Corinthians 11, which says the head of the woman is the man, and 1 Timothy 3, which specifies that a church elder should be the husband of one wife. The paper's point is that when you look at all these together, a consistent theme of male headship emerges. Now, all this evidence starts building towards what the paper considers the real theological heart of its argument. It's the idea that these gender rules aren't just arbitrary rules. They're meant to paint a picture of something way, way bigger. And the key concept here is something called living typology. So what is that? Well, think of it as a divine object lesson that God literally built into the fabric of creation. The idea is that the relationship between men and women isn't just about us. It's designed to teach everyone, including us, about eternal heavenly truths. It's a living picture. And this is the structure of that object lesson, according to the paper. It draws from 1 Corinthians 11 to argue there's this cascading pattern of headship. It starts with the relationship between God the Father and God the Son, which is then reflected in the relationship between Christ and a husband, which is then reflected in the relationship between a husband and a wife. Each tier is a mirror of the one above it. And this verse from Ephesians, well, this is the mic drop moment for the paper's argument. Paul says it himself. This whole mystery of marriage, it's about Christ and the church. So the ultimate point the paper makes is this. The husband-wife relationship was designed from the beginning of time to be a living, breathing sermon about the gospel itself. It's a picture of Christ's loving leadership over his bride, the church. And this brings it all back to how a church actually operates. The paper's big conclusion is that when a church organizes its leadership around this pattern of male headship, it's doing way more than just managing logistics. It's making a powerful, visual, nonverbal statement, a public confession that Christ is the true head of his people. Okay, so that brings us to the final part of the paper's case. And here it shifts gears from the histology to logic and even a bit of risk analysis. This is where it makes its closing argument by crunching the numbers. So the paper introduces this idea of stacked assumptions. The claim is that for the egalitarian view to be correct, it's not enough for one thing to be true. A whole chain of about 10 separate, debatable interpretations all have to be right. For example, you have to assume a very specific meaning of a rare Greek word, assume Paul's stated reasons aren't his real reasons, and assume that basically the entire church got this wrong for 2,000 years. So the paper asks this pretty blunt question. If all 10 of those assumptions have to be correct for the whole argument to hold up, what are the actual mathematical chances of that happening? And the number it lands on is, well, it's striking. About 3%. It's a pretty bold claim designed to make you stop and think about the cumulative weight of all those assumptions. So where does a number like that even come from? Well, the math behind it is interesting. The paper's model gives each of those 10 assumptions what it calls a generous 70% chance of being true. But here's the thing about probability. When you multiply 70% by 70% 10 times over, the chance of them all being true at the same time plummets to just under 3%. It's a powerful way to visualize compounding uncertainty. And that leads to the paper's final logical point, something it calls an asymmetry of risk. The argument is that the stakes aren't the same on both sides. If the complementarians are wrong, the paper says, they've just made an error of being too cautious. But if they're right, and a church practices egalitarianism, the paper claims the error is way more serious, calling it a structural inversion of God's design. So, as we bring this all to a close, this is the central idea that ties every single part of the argument together. The paper's ultimate claim is that how a church structures itself isn't just a minor organizational detail. It is a powerful public proclamation about who Christ is and how he relates to his people. And that leaves us with the final, really provocative question at the heart of this whole paper. Is the way we build our communities just a practical matter of organization? Or is the structure itself a sermon, preaching a message to the world and maybe even beyond? That's definitely something to think about.